The morning Harold Vance rode away from Eleanor Hartwell's cabin, he did not look back. He had said what needed saying. He had looked at the gaps in her walls, the crumbling mud between the logs, the door that no longer sat flush in its frame. He had done the arithmetic that Eleanor herself had already done 100 times in the dark. And he had delivered his conclusion the way a doctor delivers a terminal diagnosis, not with cruelty, but with the flat, exhausted honesty of a man who has seen this particular story end the same way too many times. Those grandchildren will freeze in their beds before February thaw. He rode north toward his own property without looking back. And Eleanor stood in the doorway of her cabin and watched the dust settle behind his horse and said nothing because there was nothing to say. He wasn't wrong. That was the part that made his words land so hard. Harold Vance was not a cruel man. He was simply a man who had learned to see the frontier clearly without the softening that hope provides. And what he saw when he looked at Eleanor Hartwell's situation was a conclusion, not a question. She was 63 years old. Her knees had been swollen since the winter of 1858, the joints grinding against each other in a way that made the stairs to the sleeping loft something she navigated carefully, one hand on the wall weight distributed with deliberate precision. Her hands still worked. Her mind still worked. But the kind of labor that produced 7 cords of firewood, the swinging of a broadaxe through post oak for weeks on end, the splitting of rounds, the stacking of cords against a cabin wall, that labor required something her body no longer possessed. And no amount of will could manufacture what bone and muscle had quietly surrendered to 63 years of living. Harold Vance knew this. Fletcher Dane knew this. Every soul in Gillespie County who had heard that Robert Hartwell was dead knew this, even if they were too polite to say it directly. Eleanor knew it too. She turned back inside. The cabin was 16 feet square, a single room of post oak logs with a sleeping loft above and a stone fireplace on the north wall. Robert had built it with his own hands in the spring of 1859, back when the hill country was still raw and the cedar was so thick you could lose a man in it at 30 yards. He had packed the gaps between the logs with mud and straw, pressing the mixture in with his fingers, smoothing it flat with his palm. Eleanor had watched him work. She had handed him water when he needed it, held the bucket when his arms were full. That chinking was 3 years old now. It had not survived 3 years well. She moved to the north wall and pressed 2 fingers into a gap near the floor. The mud crumbled at her touch. A piece the size of her palm fell away, and through the hole it left, she could see a thin strip of Texas sky, pale and hot with August heat. In January, through that same hole, she would feel a wind that had traveled from the Canadian plains without interruption, gathering cold like a debt, until it arrived at her wall to collect. She pulled her fingers back, brushed the crumbled mud from her palm. 43 gaps in the north wall alone. She had counted them that morning before Vance arrived, moving along the wall with a candle stub, watching the flame lean toward each crack where the outside air pushed through. She had marked each gap with a small smear of ash. 43 marks on the north wall, 16 on the east, 11 on the south. The west wall, sheltered by a cedar stand, had only 8. 78 gaps, and through every one of them, winter would pour. Eleanor crossed the room and sat down at the table Robert had built from a single slab of limestone hauled up from the creek. She put her hands flat on the cool stone surface. Outside, she could hear the children. Samuel's voice steady and low for a 10-year-old organizing something. Lucy's lighter voice answering. And somewhere in the yard, the sounds of June Eliza moving through the world the way 2-year-olds move, unsteadily, cheerfully, with complete confidence that the ground would hold. 3 children. Robert's grandchildren, technically the children of their son Thomas, who had died of cholera in the summer of 1862, months after Thomas's wife had died of the same fever. Eleanor had buried her son and daughter-in-law within 6 weeks of each other, and then she had dried her eyes and taken the children in because there was no one else to take them, and because that was what you did. You did what was required. You grieved on your own time when the work allowed. Robert had been alive then. Robert had been the strong one, the one who moved through the physical world with authority, who could read the weather in a cloud formation 3 days out, who could fell a post oak in under 8 minutes, who could carry 200 pounds of split wood on a sledge without slowing his pace. Robert had been the structure around which Eleanor's careful, observant, patient intelligence had organized itself for 31 years of marriage. And then in April of 1862, a chaplain's letter had arrived and Robert was gone. She had read the letter, standing in the doorway, the same doorway where she now watched Vance ride away. The chaplain wrote carefully with the practiced gentleness of a man whose entire ministry had been reduced to delivering this particular news over and over. Robert Hartwell had fallen at Shiloh, a rifle ball through the chest. He had lived long enough to give a message. Tell her I am sorry I cannot come home. Tell her to keep the land. Eleanor had read the letter twice. Then she had folded it carefully along its original creases and set it on the limestone table. Then she had gone to the hearthstone where Robert kept his money hidden and counted what was there. $14. $14 in coin cold against her palm. And then she had sat down on the packed earth floor of her cabin and wept for a long time. Not because she was weak, because she had been strong every day for 31 years. And for a few minutes, there was no one watching who needed her to be strong. When she was finished, she stood up. She washed her face. She called the children in for supper. That was April. This was August. The summer had passed in labor hauling water, tending the garden, managing the small herd of longhorns Robert had left, keeping the cabin functional enough to live in. Samuel had grown taller in ways that grief accelerates in children, his face taking on an adult gravity that had not been there before spring. Lucy had grown quieter. Little June Eliza, not yet 2 when her grandfather died, carried the loss as something she would feel her whole life without ever being able to name. Eleanor carried it differently. She carried it as arithmetic. She had watched Robert cut firewood every fall for 11 years on this land. She knew from observation what the work required. She knew that a cord of firewood weighed roughly 3,000 pounds. She knew that the cabin needed 7 cords to survive a hill, country winter 6 at minimum 7 to be safe, 8 to be comfortable. She knew that producing 1 cord required roughly 40 hours of sustained labor, felling trees, limbing them, cutting the lengths, splitting the rounds, stacking the result. 7 cords was 280 hours, 7 weeks of full days. Robert had managed that work because Robert was 58 years old and had been building muscle against a Texas landscape for 3 decades. Eleanor was 63, with knees that woke her at 3 in the morning, with a deep, grinding ache and hands that were still strong, but could not hold an axe through 40 hours of hard swing without failing long before the work was done. She could not cut 7 cords. She could not cut 5. She could gather deadfall and small branches from the cedar stands, drag them in on Robert's old wooden sledge, and produce perhaps 2 cords of inferior fuel that would burn fast and give little heat. 2 cords against a requirement of 7. The gap between those numbers was not a challenge. It was a verdict, which was, she supposed, precisely what Harold Vance had been saying. She got up from the table and went outside to check on the children. Harold Vance was 71 years old, and he had been in Gillespie County since 1848 when the hill country was Comanche territory, and a man building a cabin in these cedar breaks built it with one eye on the tree line at all times. He had survived things that had not been survived by more optimistic men than himself: 2 brutal droughts, a livestock disease that took half his herd in the winter of 1856, a blue norther in January of 1857 that killed 3 settlers in the northern part of the county. He ran the largest lime kiln operation in the settlement. He knew more about construction in this climate than any man in Gillespie County, and he knew it with the authority of someone who had learned through loss, not through study. He had come to Eleanor's property that morning because Eleanor had sent word asking about purchasing lime. She needed it for repairs, she had said. Vance had decided to see what kind of repairs she was talking about before they discussed price. What he saw when he arrived was a cabin in the second stage of failure. The first stage was the crumbling of the chinking. That was already well advanced. The second stage was the structural consequence of the cold that poured through gaps large enough to put a hand through the fire that burned through wood at twice the rate it should because half the heat escaped before it could do any work. The family that shivered inside a burning house because the house itself was no longer sealed against the world. He had dismounted and walked the perimeter of the cabin, slowly running his hand along the exterior logs, stopping to examine specific gaps, testing the door with 2 fingers. Eleanor had stood in the yard and watched him without speaking. That was something he noted about her. A lot of people filled silence with talk when they were nervous. Eleanor Hartwell filled it with observation. Her eyes moved over him carefully, the way a person watches something they are trying to understand. He told her what he saw. He told her what it would require to fix it proper, lime, the right sand, and a labor investment she simply did not have. He told her that even if she could fix the walls, she still could not produce enough firewood to survive the winter alone. He told her the solution was to sell the cattle, move to town, find people who could keep those grandchildren safe through February. She had said, "I will manage." And he had looked at her, this woman 60 years old, with her swollen knees and her steady eyes and her 63 years of Midwestern stubbornness visible in every line of her face, and he had said the thing he knew to be true. Those grandchildren will freeze in their beds before February thaw. He rode away. He did not feel good about what he had said. He felt necessary about it. There was a difference. 22 years earlier, in the winter of 1841, Harold Vance had sat inside his first cabin on this land and watched his daughter die. She was 4 years old. She had a fever that the cold made worse, and Vance had built the fire as high as the chimney would allow, and he had burned through his wood in 18 hours, and then burned furniture, and then burned fence posts while the temperature inside his cabin fell despite everything he could put in the fire. The walls of that cabin had gaps Vance could fit 3 fingers through. The heat left as fast as he could make it. His daughter died at dawn. The fire was still burning. Vance had rebuilt the cabin the following spring better. He had made it tighter. He had learned. But he had learned the specific lesson that more fuel, better fuel, and a stronger fire were the answers to a Texas winter. It was the lesson the frontier taught every man who survived it. You needed more wood. You needed enough wood. You needed the wood ready before the Blue Northers came, because when they came fast and they came merciless. And they did not care what you intended. What Harold Vance had not yet learned, what no one in Gillespie County had yet learned, because no one had thought to ask the question differently, was whether the problem was the fire or the walls. He would learn that later, from Eleanor Hartwell. But in August of 1863, riding north from her property, Vance was certain he had told her the truth. And he had. He had told her his truth, the truth of a man who had spent 22 years answering the wrong question correctly. Fletcher Dane arrived 2 days after Vance. He always arrived after Vance in matters like this. He had a pattern, and the pattern was efficient, and he had followed it profitably for 15 years. He was 54 years old, broad-shouldered, with a face that had been handsome once and had settled into something more useful, a face that inspired confidence in men who did not look carefully. He owned 160 acres adjacent to Eleanor's north fence line, and he had been watching the Hartwell property with the quiet attention of a man who had already begun calculating what he would do with it. He rode in from the north, which meant he crossed Eleanor's fence line on the upper pasture where the longhorns grazed. Eleanor was in the yard splitting kindling, small pieces, which was all she could manage for any sustained period, when she heard his horse. She set down the hatchet and waited. Dane dismounted with the easy movement of a man who is comfortable everywhere, who has never arrived anywhere he felt he did not belong. He looked at the stack of kindling. He looked at the cabin. He looked at Eleanor the way men like Dane look at women in situations like Eleanor's, not with contempt exactly, but with a kind of managerial pity, the way you look at a problem you already know the solution to. "I heard Harold Vance paid you a visit," he said. He did. And what did old Harold have to say? He said what he thought was true. Dane nodded slowly as if this confirmed something. He looked at the longhorns on the upper pasture. 19 head plus the milk cow plus 2 mixed breed steers. Robert had built that herd carefully over 11 years. It was worth real money to someone with the land and labor to manage it. To a widow of 63 with no hired help and a failing cabin, it was an asset she was about to lose to attrition animals she couldn't manage, dying of neglect, or wandering through failing fence lines into Dane's pastures. He offered $4 a head. Eleanor looked at him for a moment, not with anger, with the kind of measured stillness that some people mistake for hesitation. "The cattle are not for sale," she said. Dane smiled. It was a patient smile, the smile of a man who has learned that the best investments are the ones you simply wait for. He replaced his hat, gathered his reins, and mounted. He looked down at Eleanor from horseback for a moment, doing his own arithmetic. "You know where to find me," he said, and rode north. Eleanor watched him go. Then she picked up the hatchet and went back to splitting kindling. She understood what Fletcher Dane was. She had understood it the first time he came 3 weeks after Robert's letter arrived, when the grave dirt was barely settled, and Dane had already ridden over to discuss the practicalities of her situation. She understood that he was not evil in any interesting way. He was simply a man who believed that property found its right owner through the natural process of attrition, and that he was the natural owner of most of the property around him. He had the patience of someone who has learned that waiting costs nothing when you already have enough. What she needed to deny him was time. He was betting on February. She needed to change what February looked like before he collected. That evening, after the children were asleep, Eleanor sat at the limestone table with a stub of candle and a scrap of cloth from a worn shirt she had set aside for rags. She did not have paper to spare. She picked up a piece of charred wood from the edge of the fireplace and held it above the cloth. She wrote slowly, thinking through each word. 7 cords needed, 2 cords possible, 5 cords, 5 cords impossible. Find another way. She sat with those words for a long time. The candle threw her shadow large and unsteady against the cabin wall. Outside, she could hear the Texas night, the cedar branches moving in a light south wind, the cattle settling in the upper pasture, the sound of the creek a quarter-mile down the slope. The math was clear. She had been doing the math for 4 months, and it came out the same way every time. 7 cords was the requirement. 2 cords was her maximum. 5 cords was a gap she could not close by doing more of what she was already doing. This was the moment when most people in Eleanor's position accepted the conclusion. When they sold the cattle to Fletcher Dane and moved into Fredericksburg and found a room above the dry goods store and tried to build something smaller from what remained. When they decided that the math was the math and nothing could change it. Eleanor sat at her limestone table and stared at what she had written on the piece of cloth, and she did not accept the conclusion. Not because she was optimistic, she was not particularly. Not because she believed in miracles. She believed in limestone and cedar, and the water table and the price of salt. She didn't accept the conclusion because she had not yet asked all the questions. 7 cords needed, that was the requirement, but the requirement was calculated against a cabin that lost half its heat through 78 gaps in the walls. What if the cabin didn't lose half its heat? What if the requirement was not 7 cords for this cabin, but 7 cords for the cabin Robert had built? And this cabin, a different cabin, a sealed cabin, needed something else entirely. She stared at the 4 lines on the cloth. She did not have an answer. Not yet. But she had found the question. She folded the cloth, set it in the pocket of her apron, and went to bed. Dorothy Kessler lived half a mile down the creek and up a cedar ridge. The route involved a creek crossing that was manageable in dry weather and not manageable in wet, which meant that visits between the 2 women happened in clusters, concentrated in the dry stretches, suspended when the rains came. Dorothy was 57 years old, a widow herself since 1861 when her husband had died of a fever that moved through the settlement's adult men that winter like a collecting agent. She had survived since then through a combination of her own labor, the land she held, and the presence of her son James, who was 28, and had been born with a left foot that angled inward at the ankle, making his gait uneven and his military classification clear. He would not be going to war. James was slow. He was also strong in the way that men who grow up doing twice the work to cover the same ground become strong. His upper body had compensated for what his lower body couldn't do, and his arms and shoulders, after 28 years of compensation, were substantial. Eleanor had noted this the first time James came with his mother to the Hartwell property 3 weeks after Robert's death, when Dorothy brought a covered dish in the careful, quiet compassion of a woman who understood exactly what Eleanor was facing. Eleanor had shaken Dorothy's hand and thanked her and accepted the food, and she had watched James carry Dorothy's empty basket back to the horses with the unhurried, stable strength of someone who had made peace with his pace long ago. She had filed that observation away. Eleanor filed most observations away. Dorothy came again in late August, a few days after Vance's visit, cutting across the dry creek bed with a purpose in her step that suggested she had heard the news and wanted to talk. She was the kind of woman who approached difficult conversations directly without preamble, because she believed that preamble was how fear disguised itself as courtesy. She sat down across from Eleanor at the limestone table and said, "I heard what Harold told you." "Yes. Do you think he's right?" Eleanor considered this carefully. "In some ways. In the ways he has information for." Dorothy looked at her. What ways doesn't he have information for? Eleanor set her hands flat on the stone table. She had been thinking about how to articulate this for 3 days, and she had not yet found words she was satisfied with. She tried. "Harold is calculating how much fuel I need to heat this cabin as it is," she said. I'm thinking about whether this cabin needs to be what it is. Dorothy was quiet for a moment. The two women had known each other for 11 years, long enough for Dorothy to understand that when Eleanor said something that sounded abstract, it was usually because she was describing something precise that she hadn't fully worked out yet. "What are you thinking about doing?" Dorothy asked. Eleanor told her. Not the full plan, there was no full plan yet, only the outline of one, but the core of it. The walls, the gaps, the possibility that the problem was not the fuel but the container. Dorothy listened without interrupting, which was one of the things Eleanor valued about her. She let the idea sit in the air between them before she responded. "You'd need proper lime," Dorothy said finally. "Not just whitewash, real lime burned and slaked." "Yes, and the right sand. Creek sand, not the red clay stuff from the hillside." "Yes. Do you know how to burn lime?" Eleanor said. "I've watched Vance's operation. I understand the principle." Dorothy gave her a look that was not unkind, but was also not deferential. Understanding the principle is not the same thing as tending a kiln fire for nearly 2 weeks without losing it. "I know. You'd need to burn cedar, 50 pounds every few hours round the clock." "I know that too." Dorothy looked at her hands. Then she looked at Eleanor's. Then she said something that surprised Eleanor slightly. "Show me the limestone you're planning to use. I'll tell you if it's suitable." Eleanor led her up the creek to the limestone bluff, where she had been looking at the outcrops, gray-brown stone, in chunks layered in the bluff face where the creek had cut through it over 1,000 years. Dorothy crouched and examined several pieces, turning them over, testing their weight, pressing her thumbnail against the surface. She knew what good limestone looked like. Her husband had helped build 2 structures in the settlement using Vance's lime, and she had watched the process closely in the way that frontier women watched every process closely, because knowledge had no gender on the frontier, and you learned everything you could because you did not know when you would need it. "This is usable," Dorothy said, standing up. "Not as clean as what Vance uses, but workable." "Then it will do?" Eleanor said. Dorothy looked at her for a long moment. "You know what you're gambling. I know what I'm losing if I don't gamble." Dorothy was quiet on the walk back. She helped Eleanor carry one of the limestone samples down to the yard, and then said she needed to get back before James started worrying. She paused at the edge of the property. She said, "I'll come back in 2 weeks to see how the burning is going." And that was Dorothy Kessler. She did not tell Eleanor this was a good idea. She did not say she believed it would work. She simply agreed to come back and check. On the frontier, that kind of practical, unornamented presence was worth more than any number of encouraging words. The last week of August 1863, Eleanor Hartwell began to build a lime kiln. She dug into the creek bank slope, 3 days of slow work, with a spade whose handle was too long for her, adjusted through the leverage of someone who has learned to work with the tools available rather than the tools preferred. The pit was 4 feet deep and 3 feet across, angled to catch the south draft. She lined it with limestone chunks pried from the bluff upstream, pieces the size of her fist and larger stacked carefully to form a rough chamber. Fire below, limestone above, open top to draw air upward through the stone. The design was crude by any professional standard. Vance's operation used iron grates and measured fuel by the wagon load. Eleanor had desperation cedar in the memory of watching Vance's kiln from a distance and reconstructing its logic. Samuel helped her drag the limestone pieces down from the bluff on Robert's wooden sledge. The boy was 10 years old, his father's serious eyes and his grandfather's square face, and he worked without complaint in the way that children work when they understand the stakes, even if they cannot fully articulate them. He asked one question on the second day of dragging stone. "Is this going to work?" Eleanor said, "I believe it will." Samuel nodded and picked up his end of the sledge. Lucy, 7 years old, watched the construction with the intense cataloging attention that she brought to everything. She was the kind of child who did not speak until she had completed an interior analysis, and then she spoke precisely. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, as Eleanor was fitting the last stones into the chamber lining, Lucy said, "The fire goes underneath and the heat goes up through the rocks." "That's right. And the rocks change because of the heat." "They do." Lucy considered this. Then she said, "Like how bread changes in the oven." Eleanor looked at her granddaughter. "Yes," she said, "exactly like that." June Eliza, not yet 3, understood none of this and was occupied primarily with the large earthworm she had found at the edge of the excavation and was carrying around in her fist with an expression of profound personal satisfaction. On the evening of September 14th, 1863, Eleanor Hartwell lit the first fire in her kiln. The cedar caught quickly the way cedar always does, fast and bright and fragrant, a wood that burns enthusiastically but does not sustain. She would need to feed this fire constantly. Every 3 to 4 hours through the night, she would need to carry 40 to 50 pounds of cedar branches and feed the chamber, maintaining the temperature required to transform gray limestone into quicklime. She sat beside the fire as the first hour went by, watching the flames settle into their work. The sky above the cedar stand was enormous and dark and full of stars. The children were inside asleep. The cattle moved in the upper pasture, their bell clanking softly in the darkness. Eleanor was 63 years old, and she was beginning something that might save her family, or might be the last substantial thing she attempted before she lost the farm and the grandchildren were distributed among distant relations. She did not know which it would be. She fed the fire and she waited, and the stars moved overhead in their ancient, indifferent arc, and the kiln burned. The kiln burned for 13 days. Eleanor would remember those 13 days the way soldiers remember certain campaigns, not as a sequence of events, but as a single sustained condition, a state of being that replaced ordinary life entirely and left ordinary life feeling afterward like something that belonged to a different person. The days lost their edges. Morning and night became less about light and dark and more about which of her children was awake to watch the fire while she slept for 2 hours on the ground beside the kiln, wrapped in Robert's old wool coat, her face turned toward the heat. She had known it would be difficult. She had not known what that word contained. Cedar burns hot and fast. That is its nature, and there is nothing to be done about it except to accept the terms and plan accordingly. Every 3 to 4 hours, day and night, the fire needed feeding. 40 to 50 pounds of branches carried from the cedar stand 40 yards away, loaded by armful because she had no basket large enough and no one to help carry the weight. The branches caught quickly and burned bright and were consumed before you were ready for them to be gone. Then you carried more. Samuel took the daytime shifts when Eleanor slept. She had taught him carefully how to read the fire's color, how to judge whether the temperature was holding by the quality of the heat that rose from the chamber, how much wood to add, and how often. He was 10 years old, and he stood beside the kiln in the September heat with Robert's old leather gloves on his small hands, feeding cedar branches into the fire with a seriousness that was difficult to look at directly. Eleanor looked at it directly anyway. She had learned that looking away from hard things did not make them smaller. Lucy managed the household in ways no 7-year-old should need to manage a household. She cooked what Eleanor had time to prepare: cold cornbread left on the table beans, soaking in a pot that she could reheat when she judged the time right. She kept June Eliza occupied and safe, which was its own form of full-time labor, because June Eliza had reached the age of total mobility and zero judgment and moved through the world with the cheerful recklessness of someone who has never encountered a consequence. Lucy understood that her grandmother was fighting for something essential, even if she could not have named what it was. She fought in the way available to her, which was to hold the domestic world together so that Eleanor could focus entirely on the fire. By the 5th day, Eleanor's palms were covered in blisters. The cedar bark was rough, and she was carrying hundreds of pounds of it every 24 hours, and the friction worked on her skin with patient determination. She wrapped her hands in strips torn from a worn petticoat and kept working. The blisters filled and broke and filled again. By the 7th day, the skin beneath them had thickened into something closer to callous bone, her body making the only adaptation available to it. By the 8th day, she developed a cough from the smoke. It started in her throat and moved lower, settling into her chest with the kind of permanence that suggested it intended to stay. Each morning, she cleared her lungs over the ash pile beside the kiln. The taste of cedar smoke was in everything: her food, her water, the wool of Robert's coat, the air inside the cabin when she went in to check on the children. She lost weight she could not afford to lose. Her dress hung looser at the shoulders by the end of the first week, and by the 10th day she noticed that Samuel was watching her eat, counting her bites the way children count things when they are worried and have no other way to express it. She ate more, not because she was hungry, because Samuel was watching. On the morning of the 8th day she fell. It happened simply without drama. She was carrying her 3rd load of cedar before dawn, moving from the cedar stand toward the kiln in the dark, navigating it by memory in the orange glow of the fire ahead. Her left knee, the worst of the two, the one that had been grinding since 1858, buckled on a patch of uneven ground. She went down sideways, the cedar branches scattering around her, and she lay on the hard Texas earth in the dark and looked up at a sky that was just beginning to consider the possibility of dawn. She lay still for a moment. Her knee throbbed. Her hands were bleeding through the cloth wrappings. The cedar branches were scattered in a rough circle around her, representing 30 minutes of gathering and carrying, now requiring gathering again. She was 63 years old, and she was lying on the ground in the dark, and the kiln was burning, and no one was coming. Above her, the sky was doing what the Texas sky does in the hour before dawn, becoming something extraordinary, without drawing attention to it, the darkness thinning in degrees, the stars fading at the edges, while holding bright at the center. It was a beautiful sky. Eleanor noticed this from the ground. Even at 63, even in the 8th day of a labor that was using her up, she noticed a beautiful sky. She got up, not because she felt strong, not because the pain was manageable, because the fire needed feeding, and Samuel was asleep, and the limestone in the chamber would not transform itself. She gathered the scattered cedar. She carried it to the kiln. She fed the fire. What she did not know, what she discovered only when she returned to the kiln after her next 2 hours' sleep, was that Samuel had woken in the night and found her missing from her usual sleeping place beside the kiln. He had not woken her. He had taken over the feeding himself, quietly working by firelight, maintaining the temperature for 4 hours until Eleanor reappeared. When she came back and saw him, there, this 10-year-old boy with Robert's leather gloves and his father's serious eyes feeding cedar into a fire at 4 in the morning, she stopped walking. She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back at her with an expression that was trying very hard to be matter-of-fact. "I checked the color like you showed me," he said. "It looked right." She crossed to him and put a wrapped hand on the side of his face. She did not say anything because there was nothing to say that would be adequate. He leaned into her hand for exactly 1 second, and then he straightened and said he was going to get more cedar. That was when Eleanor understood something she had not fully understood before. She had thought of her knowledge, the knowledge she was betting everything on the remembered technique of hair and lime and sealed walls, as something she was carrying alone, as a private wager between herself and the Texas winter. But watching Samuel manage the fire with competence, watching Lucy manage the household, watching June Eliza accept the disruption of their lives with the adaptability of the very young, she understood that the knowledge was not something she was carrying. It was something she was transmitting. And what she could transmit might outlast what she could physically sustain. She filed this understanding away and went to get more cedar. Fletcher Dane came on the 11th day. He had heard, of course. The settlement was small enough that secrets moved through it the way creek water moves through limestone, finding every passage emerging somewhere unexpected, impossible to stop. Dane had heard that the Hartwell widow was burning wood to make lime. He had heard the phrase that had apparently been making its circuit through the community pass from farm to farm with the tone people use for stories that confirm what they already believed: cow hair on the walls. He rode in from the north the way he always came. Eleanor heard his horse and did not stop working. She was splitting cedar into manageable lengths for the kiln, her form still inefficient after 11 days, each stroke landing slightly wrong, achieving perhaps half of what Robert would have achieved with the same effort. She kept swinging as Dane dismounted. He watched her for several minutes without speaking. She could feel his eyes on her work on the kiln, on the arrangement of the cedar piles, doing his accounting the way he always did his accounting, measuring everything against what it was worth to him. When she finally paused to clear her lungs of smoke and wipe her face, Dane spoke. "Cow hair on the walls," he said. The amusement in his voice was not cruel exactly. It was the amusement of someone watching a performance they expect to end badly. Eleanor said nothing. Dane leaned forward in his saddle. "You're burning your cedar to make plaster when you should be cutting your cedar for the fire." He let that sit for a moment. "What are you going to tell those grandchildren when the cold comes that their grandmother was smearing hair on the walls instead of feeding the hearth?" "I will tell them nothing," Eleanor said. "They will be warm." Something moved across Dane's face. Not quite respect. More like recalibration, the brief adjustment of a man who expected easy and is finding something else. He settled his weight back in the saddle. $5 a head for the cattle," he said. "Today. That's enough to hire a man to cut wood through October. Or you can keep burning your cedar for lime and freeze in November." His voice had found its practical register, again the voice of a man offering a straightforward business arrangement. The cattle are not for sale. He looked at her the way Harold Vance had looked at her. The same slow headshake, the same geometry of certainty. But where Vance's certainty had come from grief and hard-won knowledge, Dane's came from something colder, from the simple arithmetic of power, the confidence of a man who has always had enough to wait. "I'll be back in December," he said, "if there's anything left to buy." He rode north. Eleanor picked up the hatchet. She understood, standing there in the cedar smoke with blisters on both hands and a cough she couldn't clear, that Fletcher Dane was not wrong about the apparent logic of her situation. What she was doing looked from the outside like a woman burning resources she couldn't spare on a project that contradicted common sense. She was burning cedar to make lime instead of burning cedar for heat. She was investing labor in the walls of her cabin instead of investing labor in her woodpile. Every experienced person in the county, Vance Dane probably, Dorothy probably, the people who had whispered about her at the settlement store, would look at this and see a widow making the last bad decision of a series of bad decisions. She swung the hatchet into a cedar log. She had one chance. She had chosen it. The time for second-guessing was before you lit the kiln, not 11 days into the burn. On the evening of the 13th day, Eleanor raked the ash from the kiln's base and examined what remained. The limestone had changed. The gray-brown chunks she had stacked 2 weeks earlier were now white, not a surface whiteness, but a deep structural whiteness, the color of something transformed from the inside out. When she touched a piece, it felt chalky against her fingertips. When she dropped one, it shattered on the ground with a brittleness that the original limestone had not had. She crumbled a piece between her palms and felt it powder into fine dust. Quicklime, 6 bushels of it born from fire and stone. She knelt beside the kiln in the fading light and allowed herself 30 seconds of something that was not quite satisfaction, but was the closest thing to it she had permitted since April. Her hands were bleeding through the bandages. Her chest rattled with each breath. She was lighter by 10 pounds than she had been in August. She could feel her heartbeat in her knee. The lime was good. The frost was 4 weeks away. She was still in the mathematics of the possible. She stood up and called the children to supper. Slaking the lime was dangerous work, and Eleanor did not pretend otherwise. She dug a shallow pit behind the cabin, lined it with the least porous stones she could find, and shoveled the quicklime in. Then she sent the children to the far side of the cabin. "Stay there," she told them. "Do not come around until I call you, no matter what you hear." Samuel looked at her. "What will we hear?" She considered being vague, decided against it. "The lime will react to water the way fire reacts to fuel. It will boil. It will steam. It will sound like something alive. That is normal. Stay back." She filled the bucket at the creek and walked back to the pit. The quicklime sat inert, white, and powdery, patient in the way that powerful things are patient before their moment arrives. She poured. The reaction was immediate and complete. The powder hissed, then roared, then erupted into a churning white mass that released heat and steam in waves. She stepped back, shielding her face with her forearm, feeling the heat even at 6 feet. The temperature in the pit climbed fast enough that she could feel it on the skin of her hands from a yard away. The lime churned and bubbled, moving with the strange self-contained violence of something that generates its own energy. From around the corner of the cabin, she heard June Eliza say something inquiring. Lucy's voice answered firm and settled. The small sounds of a 7-year-old managing a not-yet 3-year-old with the competence of someone twice her age. The reaction lasted 20 minutes. When it finished, the pit held a thick white paste, caustic, smooth, and chemical smelling, the fundamental substance of every plastered wall in the county. Lime putty. The reaction had worked. The chemistry had done what chemistry does, indifferent to whether Eleanor Hartwell was a widow or a pioneer or a 63-year-old woman with swollen knees and a rattling cough. She covered the pit with wet cloth and left it to mature for a week. While the lime cured, she gathered sand. The creek bed provided what she needed: clean sand free of the red clay that made bad plaster the right grain size to bond properly with the lime. She filled 2 bushels at a time in the wooden buckets Robert had used for water hauling, loaded them onto the sledge, and dragged them 800 yards uphill to the cabin. 20 trips over 5 days. Her shoulders developed a deep, sustained ache that began each morning the moment she lifted the first load, and ended only when she lay down at night, and sometimes not even then. She did not allow herself to count the trips while she was making them. She had learned this from 40 years of hard work, that counting the remaining distance was a form of self-destruction, a way of making the work heavier than it actually was. She counted only what was already done. 2 trips, 4, 7, 12. The number that was already behind her, already finished, already out of the debt column. By the second week of October, she had 22 bushels of sand stacked against the cabin's south wall. More than enough for the job. The children prepared the hair. This had become their particular contribution, and they had taken ownership of it with the kind of focused pride that children invest in tasks they have been trusted with. Samuel and Lucy walked the fences and brushed the rubbing posts every morning, gathering the loose hair where the longhorns had scratched through the summer. They found tufts in the barn clinging to the rough posts. They found more in the cedar breaks where the herd sheltered from wind, long curly clumps the color of dried grass, coarse and dense, and tangled with bits of bark. Eleanor had shown Lucy how to cut the hair to manageable lengths using the sewing scissors, and how to tease it by hand, afterwards separating the clumps into individual fibers that would distribute evenly through the plaster rather than clumping into useless masses. Lucy had shown Samuel. Samuel had shown June Eliza what to do with the small pieces that were already short enough. Even the youngest child had work, which meant the youngest child felt part of something rather than simply waiting for something to end. By mid-October, they had 12 pounds of prepared cattle hair, more than Eleanor needed. The excess felt like a kind of abundance given everything. On the morning after the first frost, October 8th, when she woke to find ice in the water bucket by the door and the mercury sitting at 34 degrees, Eleanor began to mix plaster. 1 bucket of lime putty, 3 buckets of creek sand. Water from the creek, added slowly, stirred with the garden hoe until the mixture reached the consistency of thick mud, heavy enough to cling to a vertical surface, fluid enough to press into a narrow gap. She worked in the wooden trough behind the cabin, the same trough Robert had used for mixing mortar when he built the fireplace. It still smelled of the old work of an older dust. Then the hair. She added it by handfuls, Lucy standing beside her and passing the prepared clumps, Eleanor working each handful into the mixture with her fingers before adding the next. The plaster changed as the hair went in. It became more cohesive, less prone to the slow slumping that pure lime sand mix was prone to. The fibers distributed through the gray mass and bound it together the way threads bind a fabric, individually fragile, collectively strong. She lifted a handful and pressed it against the back of her hand. It stuck. When she pulled it away, it left a smooth gray film. It was the right consistency. She carried the first batch to the north wall. Standing in front of that wall with its 43 marked gaps, with its daylight visible through the largest cracks, with the October wind and already finding every opening and pushing through with a cold that was only a preview of what January would do, Eleanor pressed the first handful of plaster into the first gap. Her bare hands. The cloth wrappings were too clumsy for this work, too thick to feel the contours of the logs, to push the mixture deep into every crevice, rather than bridging it superficially. She needed to feel what she was doing. The lime burned where it contacted her skin. She worked anyway. First gap sealed, a smooth white patch against the dark oak, maybe 4 inches wide and 8 inches long. She ran her finger across it. No give, no flex, solid. Second gap, third, fourth. By midday, she had done perhaps 8 square feet of wall. By nightfall, she had done 12. Her hands were raw, and the burns from the lime had overlaid themselves on the blisters from the kiln work, producing a complex and layered pain that she had learned to work around the way you work around a bad step in an old floor. You know where it is, you avoid putting your full weight on it, you keep moving. For 8 days, she worked in 12-hour shifts, mixing at dawn, applying until she could no longer see by the failing light, sleeping 5 hours when the children were settled, rising before them to mix again. Every gap between the logs on the interior walls, every crack around the doorframe, every place where the old mud chinking had fallen away and left a passage for the cold. The ceiling joists where drafts moved along the upper wall. The floor edges where cold air crept upward from the ground beneath the boards. She moved along the walls slowly, methodically, with the patience of someone doing work that must be done correctly because there will be no second attempt. Samuel steadied the ladder when she climbed to reach the high gaps near the ceiling. Lucy handed up fresh plaster from below. June Eliza watched from her blanket near the fireplace, cataloging the proceedings with the serious attention of the very young. By the end of the 8th day, Eleanor could not make a fist. The joints of her fingers had swollen enough to limit the range of motion, the skin too cracked and too lime-burned to flex without splitting open. She adapted. She pressed plaster with the heel of her hand smooth with her wrist, worked the mixture into corners with the edge of her palm. The work did not permit stopping. She found other ways to do it. By the 12th day, the interior was done. She stood in the center of the cabin and looked at her walls. White and smooth and unbroken, the gaps she had marked in August, now sealed tight under a coat of lime and sand and cattle hair. She held a candle near the north wall and watched the flame. It stood straight. Not a whisper of outside air reached it. She allowed herself to feel this for a moment. Then she went outside to start on the exterior walls. The exterior was slower. She was working from outside now, standing in October wind with cold hands and lime on her face, pressing plaster into gaps from the other direction, not to duplicate the interior coat, but to seal any places where the plaster had not fully penetrated from inside, and to give the walls a second layer of protection against the weather. It was harder work because the cold stiffened the mixture faster and stiffened her hands with it. She warmed the water slightly before mixing, which helped. She worked the plaster with more speed, getting it into the gaps before it lost workability. On the 4th day of exterior work, October 22nd, the rain came. It arrived in the afternoon without much warning. The sky had been overcast all day, but overcast skies in October did not always deliver, and Eleanor had been watching it with one eye while she worked. When the first drops hit her face, she looked up and understood immediately that this was not a light shower. This was a slow, heavy, sustained rain, the kind the hill country produced when the weather pattern stalled and the moisture came down for hours. She could not stop the rain. She could not cover the exterior walls. She could not accelerate the curing process that had been underway for only 4 days and needed 4 more to reach the hardness that would resist water. She put her tools down and went inside. The rain fell for 6 hours. She listened to it from inside the cabin, sitting at the limestone table with her hands in her lap, too tired to do anything except wait. June Eliza slept on her pallet near the fire. Samuel read from the single book they owned, moving his lips slightly over words that were too advanced for him, but that he was working through anyway, which was very much a Samuel approach to things. Lucy sat beside Eleanor at the table and said nothing, which was what Eleanor needed and which Lucy somehow knew. When the rain stopped, Eleanor went outside with the lantern. 3 sections of the north wall exterior, plaster the sections she had applied on the first 2 days before the lime had reached any real hardness, had washed away. The rain had reclaimed them cleanly, leaving raw wood exposed, the gaps reopened as if the 2 days of work had never happened. She raised the lantern and looked at the damage for a long time. She was 63 years old, and she was exhausted in a way that had gone beyond physical and become something more fundamental, a weariness of the very mechanisms of effort, a fatigue that sat not in her muscles but somewhere behind her eyes. Her hands were burned and swollen. Her chest rattled with the smoke cough she had carried since the kiln. The frost was 2 weeks away, and 3 sections of her north wall were open again to the world. She sat down on the ground outside her cabin in the dark, in the wet earth, with the lantern beside her. And then, in the dark outside her cabin with mud on her skirt and lime burns on her hands, Eleanor Hartwell did something she had not permitted herself to do since she read the chaplain's letter in April of 1862. She came close to stopping, not out of weakness, out of the simple arithmetic of a body that had been doing the impossible for 6 weeks and had arrived at the edge of what was possible looking over. She sat in the wet earth and felt the full weight of the gap between what she had attempted and what she had, and for a few minutes she let herself feel it without fighting it. The candle in the lantern burned steadily. She watched it for several minutes. Then she stood up. She went inside. She laid out her tools for morning. She went to sleep. At dawn, she mixed fresh plaster. Dorothy Kessler arrived on October 29th. She came across the dry creek bed with her son James moving behind her. James's uneven gait, steady as always, unhurried, compensated for by the upper body that had spent 28 years making adjustments. Dorothy was carrying 2 bushels of dried corn and a quarter hog of salt pork, and she did not apologize for the presence of either. Eleanor stood in the doorway of her cabin with her hands wrapped in fresh cloth, and she did not know what to say, which was unusual for her. Dorothy said, "A loan you'll repay when you can." It was charity. They both understood it. But Dorothy had found the words that made it possible to accept without requiring Eleanor to become something smaller than herself in the accepting. This was a skill that Dorothy had, and it was worth more than the corn and the pork. Dorothy looked at Eleanor's hands, then she looked at the walls. "Show me how you mix it," Dorothy said. She had plastered walls before. In her girlhood in the East before her family moved west, she had helped her mother replaster a stone farmhouse in Pennsylvania, working with lime and sand and horsehair, in a process similar enough to what Eleanor was doing, that her hands remembered the technique before her mind had fully recalled it. She worked beside Eleanor for 3 days, her technique cleaner and stronger, her pace faster. Together, they covered twice the ground Eleanor had managed alone. The north wall exterior was finished by the second day, the east wall by the third. While they worked, James moved into the cedar stand with the broad axe Robert had left hanging in the barn. He was slow. He was not fast. But he was 28 years old and powerfully built across the shoulders and back, and the uneven foot that had kept him out of the Confederate Army had no relevance to the mechanics of splitting post oak. He worked through 3 days, steady, unhurried, efficient, in the way that people who cannot waste effort become efficient. And when Dorothy told Eleanor that James had been cutting firewood in lieu of paying for their share of Eleanor's next lime burn, Eleanor looked at the wood stacked against the cabin wall and said, "That is more than fair." It was 2 cords. 2 cords she had not earned and could not have produced. She accepted them. The night after Dorothy and James left, Eleanor sat at the limestone table alone after the children were asleep. The cabin was quiet. The fire burned low and steady. She had a total of 4 cords stacked outside, 2 from her own gathering of deadfall, and small branches, 2 from James Kessler's 3 days with the broadaxe. Half of what Harold Vance had told her she needed. She sat with that number and thought about what it meant. 4 cords of inferior fuel against a requirement of 7 cords in a standard cabin. But this was not a standard cabin anymore. Every gap had been sealed from inside and out. No daylight came through the north wall. The door fit flush in its frame for the first time since Robert built it. She had tested the south-facing window's oiled paper twice this week, looking for drafts along the edges, and found nothing. If the plaster held, if her calculations were correct, if the memory of her father-in-law's church walls had translated properly across 40 years, and one woman's determination, she might need 3 cords. She might need 3.5. She would not know until the real cold came. 4 cords against an unknown requirement. A sealed cabin against the blue northers of a Texas January. She sat at the limestone table with the candle burning down and allowed herself, for the first time since she lit the kiln in September, to think the word enough. Not certain, not safe, not comfortable, just enough. On November 2nd, 1863, Eleanor Hartwell pressed the last handful of plaster into the last gap above the doorframe. She stepped back and looked at her walls. White and smooth. No cracks, no gaps, no daylight showing through. She had used all 6 bushels of lime, 20 bushels of sand, 10 pounds of cattle hair. She had worked for 43 days on a total of 4 to 5 hours of sleep per night. The burns on her hands would scar. The cough was still in her chest. The weight she had lost was not coming back before spring. She walked outside and stood in the November light and looked at the exterior of her cabin. White and smooth and sealed, the old post oak logs held in a skin of lime that was stronger than mud and would not crumble in a freeze-thaw cycle the way mud crumbled. Then she walked back inside and stood in the center of the room. She held a lit match near the north wall, near the door frame, near the east wall, the west wall, the floor edges. The flame did not lean, not once, not anywhere. Eleanor blew out the match. She stood in her sealed cabin and allowed herself 30 seconds of something that was not pride. She had no particular use for pride, which was a luxury that required an audience, but was instead the quiet, internal recognition of a person who has done what they set out to do. Then she called the children in for supper, because supper still needed making. The frost had come on October 8th. November was settling into the pattern that preceded the real cold nights in the 20s, days in the 40s, the kind of chill that was not dangerous but was a messenger, a promise of what the messenger's employer was preparing. Eleanor stacked her 4 cords tightly against the south wall of the cabin, where the sun would dry any lingering moisture from the split wood. She noted the position of the woodpile in relation to the door, close enough to carry loads without exposure, far enough from the cabin wall to prevent any fire risk from sparks. She replenished the water barrels from the creek and sealed them with the wooden covers Robert had made. She checked the cattle fence on the upper pasture and found two sections that needed resetting, which she did herself with the post driver, driving each post with the patient leverage-based technique of someone who has learned to multiply force to compensate for mass. She salted the pork and flour and dried beans into the storage crib beneath the sleeping loft. She did everything that needed doing before January because January was coming and January did not accommodate the things you had meant to do in November. In December, the first real cold settled over Gillespie County. Temperatures dropped to the 20s at night, the 40s by midday, a steady and serious cold that was not yet the worst, but was enough to test everything. Eleanor built a moderate fire each morning and let it reduce to coals by afternoon. She checked the interior temperature with Robert's mercury thermometer, the wedding gift from his father hung beside the door, the instrument that would tell her whether she was right or wrong about everything. 54 degrees on the first cold morning, 51 on the second when she let the fire go lower, 48 at dawn before she stoked it again. The walls were not breathing, the drafts were gone. The fire's heat was staying inside the room, working for her instead of escaping through 78 gaps into the Texas night. She burned 1/3 of a cord for the entire month of December. 1/3 of a cord, against the full cord Harold Vance burned that same month in a larger but less sealed cabin, with his family wearing their coats indoors. She wrote the number in charcoal on the piece of cloth below the 4 lines she had written in August. 7 cords needed, 2 cords possible, 5 cords impossible. Find another way. And below them now, December 1/3 cord. Inside 51 degrees Fahrenheit, 4 cords remaining. The math has changed. She folded the cloth and put it back in her apron pocket. On New Year's Eve, she sat beside her fire with Samuel and Lucy and June Eliza and allowed herself to believe, quietly and without ceremony, that she was going to make it through the winter. 2.5 cords remained outside. The cabin held warmth the way a cupped hand holds water. January was a week away. She did not know that the worst was still ahead of her. She did not know about the blue wall of cloud that would build on the northern horizon on January 14th. She did not know about the 42 degrees in 4 hours or the mercury reading she would see at 3 in the morning that would make her weep in the dark. She did not know about any of it yet. She sat with her grandchildren in their warm cabin and listened to the cedar branches moving in the New Year's wind outside, and she let herself feel something she had not felt since April of 1862. Not happiness exactly. Happiness was a different country accessible later after more distance from grief, but something adjacent to it, something that had the same address. She let herself feel it quietly, without drawing attention to it. Winter was not finished with Eleanor Hartwell, but neither was Eleanor Hartwell finished with winter. January arrived the way the old-timers said. It always arrived in the hill country quietly at first, with a deceptive patience that lulled you into believing the worst was behind you. The first week brought temperatures in the teens at night and the low 30s by midday, a cold that was serious but manageable, the kind that required a good fire in the morning and a coat when you went to the woodpile, and nothing more extreme than that. Eleanor's cabin held above 50 degrees with a fire she kept deliberately modest, not because she was rationing carefully, though she was, but because she had begun to understand that the cabin did not need what she had always assumed it needed. The sealed walls changed the mathematics of warmth in ways she was still learning to trust. She had begun keeping records. Each morning before the children woke, she crossed to the door and read Robert's mercury thermometer, the one his father had given them as a wedding gift, brass-cased and slightly fogged at the lower end of the scale from decades of cold mornings. She noted the interior temperature on the cloth she carried in her apron pocket beside the charcoal marks she had made in August and December. Each evening she marked how much wood she had burned. January 1st through 7th, less than 1/6 of a cord consumed. Interior temperature never below 47 degrees, even on the night the creek froze at its edges, and the cattle stood pressed together in the upper pasture, exhaling visible clouds of breath in the moonlight. The math had not just changed, the math had inverted. At this rate, her remaining wood would last well into April. She would finish the winter with a surplus, something she had not permitted herself to imagine as recently as November, when surplus had seemed like a word that belonged to other people's lives. She sat with this knowledge each morning at the limestone table, turning it over the way you turn over a coin that you found in an unexpected place, not quite believing it belongs to you. But the old-timers watched the sky with worry, and Eleanor watched the old-timers. She had learned over 30 years in the hill country to read the community's collective anxiety the way you read weather signs, not as individual data points, but as a pattern, a convergence of unease that meant something even when no one could say exactly what. In the second week of January, she noticed it at the settlement store, where two of the older men stood outside after their business was done and looked north for longer than the conversation required. She noticed it in the way Harold Vance, whom she saw at a distance crossing the road toward the feed merchant, stopped for a moment and stood still, his head slightly raised as if listening for something below the range of ordinary hearing. The sky was too stable, the cold too measured and consistent. In a Texas hill country January, that kind of stability was not a gift. It was a compression. Pressure building somewhere far to the north, loading itself against the landmass gathering until the accumulated weight of it became impossible to hold. When it broke, it would break all at once. Eleanor thought about this as she worked through the second week of January, finishing the small tasks that winter permitted: mending harness, leather patching the children's clothing, where the knees had worn through resetting two loose hearthstones that had shifted in the fall. She thought about the remaining 2.5 cords of firewood stacked against the south wall, and she thought about the sealed cabin, and she thought about the distance between what she knew and what she could not yet know. She was 63 years old, and she had learned over 63 years that the distance between those two things was where most of life's important events occurred. On the 10th of June, Eliza began to cough. It was a small thing at first, a dry rasp in the morning, gone by the time the sun cleared the cedar stand to the east. Eleanor heard it and noted it and did not immediately worry, because children coughed in winter. It was one of the reliable constants of the season. In June, Eliza was 2 years old and constitutionally robust, the kind of small child who fell and rose and fell again without apparent damage, who ate with appetite and slept hard, and filled the cabin with sounds that were a continual low-level argument against despair. By the 12th, the cough had changed, not louder, deeper, a different quality, something that had moved from the throat into the chest and was establishing itself there with the settled permanence of a tenant who has decided not to leave. Eleanor put her hand to June Eliza's forehead on the night of the 12th. Warm, not alarmingly warm, but present a heat that did not belong there, slight but real. She brewed willow bark tea, stripping the bark from the branches she kept dried and stored for this purpose. Robert had taught her that, or she had learned it watching Robert, which amounted to the same thing. She sweetened it with a small amount of the remaining honey and coaxed the tea into June Eliza a tablespoon at a time, the child accepting it with the resigned compliance of someone who has decided that cooperation is faster than resistance. The night of the 12th passed. The night of the 13th passed. On the morning of January 14th, Eleanor lifted June Eliza from her pallet and felt it immediately. The heat in her skin had climbed. Not a suggestion now, a declaration. The child's cheeks were flushed and dry, her eyes slightly glazed with the particular unfocused quality that high fever produces. And when Eleanor pressed her lips to June Eliza's forehead, the most reliable thermometer she had, the heat against her mouth told her what she needed to know. 103 degrees, perhaps higher. She set June Eliza down carefully on the pallet near the fire and stood still for a moment, doing the calculation that had become her instinct, the rapid, clear-eyed assessment of available options against available resources. Dorothy Kessler was 1.5 miles down the creek. The road involved the creek crossing, which was frozen at the edges and unpredictable at the center. Carrying a feverish 2-year-old through January cold to reach help would require Eleanor to leave Samuel and Lucy alone in the cabin, which she would not do, and would expose June Eliza to temperatures that could compound a fever into something worse. Sending Samuel alone to Dorothy's was possible, but required him to navigate the creek crossing by himself, and the boy was 10 years old. She looked at the 3 children. Samuel at the table watching her face for information. Lucy beside him already reading the situation from Eleanor's posture. June Eliza on the pallet breathing in shallow intervals that Eleanor counted without appearing to count. She would manage this alone, as she had managed everything else alone. She had willow bark tea and cool cloths and the warmth of a sealed cabin and 40 years of watching children through illness. It would have to be enough. She put Samuel in charge of the firewood, not to build the fire higher, but to keep it steady, to maintain the warmth the cabin held, without driving the air into the dryness that hurt sick lungs. She showed him the difference on the thermometer between what she wanted and what she was trying to avoid. He understood. He always understood when she showed him things precisely. Then she pulled her chair to June Eliza's pallet and settled in for whatever was coming. It was noon. At noon on January 14th, Eleanor stepped outside briefly to check the woodpile and breathe air that was not wood smoke. She stood in the yard for a moment, face turned slightly south into the thin winter sunlight. 48 degrees and a light south wind carrying the last warmth before whatever was north of them arrived. She looked north. The sky above the cedar stand was the ordinary pale blue of a Texas January midday. And then, at the horizon, it was not. At the horizon, a line of deep blue-black stretched from east to west as far as she could see in either direction, and it was moving south with a speed that she felt before she consciously registered what she was seeing. The line was solid, absolute, the edge of something so large it had its own weather system, its own interior logic, its own agenda, that had nothing to do with the plans of the people in its path. Blue Norther, a big one. Eleanor did not stand and watch it. She crossed the yard in 12 strides, opened the cabin door, looked at Samuel and said, "Bring in every piece of wood you can carry. Right now. As fast as you can." Samuel was out the door before she finished the sentence. She stacked what he brought inside against the interior wall, quick and close enough for 48 hours if they were careful. She checked the door latch solid, the new one she had reset in October, fitted properly to the frame. She checked the window, the oiled paper taut and sealed at its edges. She filled every available container with water from the barrel outside, because water barrels left outside in what was coming would be solid ice before morning. By the time she finished, the south wind had stopped. The silence that replaced it lasted perhaps 90 seconds. Then the north wind arrived. It did not build gradually. It came from stillness to full violence in the space of a breath, a wall of cold air moving south at speed, carrying temperature that was not merely cold, but structural, a cold that was part of the architecture of the air itself. Eleanor felt it through the cabin walls as a sound, first a low, sustained roar in the cedar stand that rose to a scream as the branches bent and the smaller trees whipped sideways. Then she felt it as pressure, as if the air on the north side of the cabin had suddenly become denser, heavier, leaning against the logs with intent. She stood in the center of her cabin and listened to the walls. They did not speak. There was no whistle of air through gaps, no draft along the floor, no cold fingers of outside air reaching into the room. The roar was outside. The warmth was inside. The line between them was the plastered lime and sand and cattle hair that she had pressed into place with her burned hands across 43 days of work. The line held. She went back to June Eliza. The fever had climbed through the afternoon. By 2 o'clock, the flush in the child's cheeks was deeper, and her breathing had shortened further each breath, a shallow, quick event that Eleanor counted in her peripheral attention while doing everything else that needed doing. Cool cloths on the forehead changed every 20 minutes. Willow bark tea offered by the spoonful when the child would accept it. The fire maintained at exactly the level Samuel was managing, steady, warm, not aggressive. Outside, the norther was doing what a blue norther does. Eleanor heard it in the timber, the crack of cedar branches under the ice load that had formed on them almost instantly as the temperature dropped, each crack like a rifle shot in the frozen air. She heard it in the spaces between those sounds, the deep howling of wind through a landscape that offered no shelter, no break, no quarter. She heard it as a sustained, violent transformation of the world outside her door into something that could kill you in the time it took to walk from the woodpile to the cabin. The thermometer on the outside of the door frame, which she could read through the window without opening anything, had dropped from 48 degrees at noon to 22 degrees by 2 o'clock. By 3, it read 8 degrees. By 4, she could no longer read it clearly through the darkening afternoon light and the film of ice that was forming on the oiled paper window. She did not need to read it. She knew what was outside from the sounds it made. Inside her cabin, the thermometer read 58 degrees. She had built the fire slightly higher when June Eliza's fever climbed, not high, not extravagantly, but enough. The warmth the sealed walls were holding amplified the fire's modest contribution into something more than the fire alone could have produced. The room was genuinely warm. The children were in their ordinary clothes, not wearing coats indoors, not pressed against the hearth for survival, Samuel had spread his blanket near the fire and was reading, or pretending to read. His eyes moved too slowly across the page for real reading, and Eleanor understood that he was watching June Eliza from beneath the pretense of the book. Lucy had fallen asleep against Samuel's shoulder in the early evening, exhausted by the particular drain of sustained low-grade fear. She was 7 years old, and she had been holding herself together through a great deal. Eleanor let her sleep. She sat beside June Eliza's pallet and did the only things available to her: cool cloth, tea, the counting of breaths, prayer which she engaged in without expectation of mechanical intervention, but with the deep human need to direct some of what she was feeling outward into something larger than herself that might or might not be listening. The fever reached what she estimated to be 104 degrees by early evening. This was the threshold that frightened her, not the number itself, but what the number represented in a body as small as June Eliza's. A body that had been in the world for only 2 years and had not yet built the reserves that make fever survivable by attrition. She changed the cloth on June Eliza's forehead. The child stirred and turned her face slightly, seeking the coolness without waking. Eleanor held the cloth in place and watched her breathe. "Mama," June Eliza said without opening her eyes. Not Eleanor's name. The name of June Eliza's mother, who had been dead for 3 years and whose face this child did not remember. "I'm here," Eleanor said. "I'm right here." Outside, a cedar tree gave way. The sound of it, the crack, the sustained groan, the final impact moved through the frozen air and through the cabin walls and settled into the room like a stone dropped into still water. June Eliza did not wake. Samuel looked up from his book. Eleanor met his eyes across the room and held them for a moment, communicating nothing in particular except presence. He nodded and looked back down. The hours passed the way hours pass in a crisis, not smoothly and not quickly, but in segments of varying length that bore no relationship to the clock. Eleanor lost track of the count somewhere after 9 in the evening. She added wood at intervals she judged by the fire's color and the thermometer, which held steady between 54 and 58 degrees throughout the night. The sealed walls were doing their work. The 4 cords stacked outside were being drawn on at a rate that would have seemed impossibly frugal 6 months ago, and now simply seemed like the natural consequence of a cabin that had been made to work properly. At some point in the deep middle of the night, she checked the exterior thermometer by opening the door an inch and holding the lantern close. She closed the door immediately, stood with her back against it, 11 degrees below zero. She had lived in Texas for 31 years, and she had never seen that number. She had heard the old-timers describe winters, this severe speaking of them, the way people speak of things they barely survived, with a kind of compressed reverence, not for the cold itself, but for what surviving it had cost. 11 below. The kind of cold that moved past the category of weather and into the category of geological fact, something as indifferent and absolute as the limestone bluffs along the creek. She turned and looked at her cabin's interior thermometer. 49 degrees, 60 degrees of difference between outside and inside. 60 degrees held in place by walls she had sealed with her own hands with lime she had burned herself. With cattle hair her grandchildren had gathered and prepared with knowledge she had carried for 40 years in the back of her mind without knowing she would need it. The walls were keeping their promise. She crossed to June Eliza's pallet and pressed her lips to the child's forehead. The heat was different. Not gone, the fever was still present, still real, but the quality of it had changed. The dry climbing intensity of the afternoon had softened into something wetter, more yielding. June Eliza's skin was damp under Eleanor's lips, damp with the perspiration that comes when a fever breaks its peak and begins slowly to recede. Eleanor lifted her head, sat very still for a moment. She put her hand on June Eliza's chest and counted the breaths, slower than they had been at midnight. Deeper. The shallow, rapid, shallow quality of the crisis was not there anymore. The child breathed with a steadiness that was still labored, but was moving toward normal, the way a storm moves toward its end, not suddenly but in perceptible degrees. The fever was breaking. Eleanor sat beside her granddaughter's pallet in her sealed cabin at 11 degrees below zero, in the darkest hour of January 15th, 1864, and she wept. Not from relief, though relief was part of it. Not from exhaustion, though she was exhausted beyond any previous understanding of the word. She wept in the way that people weep when something they have been holding at a precise, controlled distance for a very long time finally comes close enough to touch, when the thing you have been managing becomes for a moment the thing you are feeling. She wept for Robert, whose hands had built these walls and whose money under the hearthstone had been $14, and whose last words had been tell her to keep the land. She wept for Thomas and Thomas's wife, whose children were sleeping by this fire because Eleanor was still alive to keep them. She wept for the 43 days and the burned hands in the lime kiln and the 13 nights of cedar smoke in the piece of cloth with its charcoal arithmetic. She wept briefly and completely, and then she stopped. She wiped her face. She changed the cloth on June Eliza's forehead. She added one careful log to the fire. She sat in her warm cabin in the worst cold in 30 years of Texas winters, and she waited for morning. It came slowly, the way winter mornings come, not with the dramatic color of summer, but with a gradual lightening, a reluctant brightening, as if the sun itself was uncertain whether the effort was warranted. Eleanor stood at the window and watched the world outside her cabin resolve itself from darkness into visibility. The snow was deep. Drifts had formed against the fence posts and the woodpile in the north side of the cabin, white and windblown and hard-packed, shaped by the violence of the night into forms that looked almost deliberate. The cedar stand was transformed branches sheathed in ice that caught the early light and scattered it in small, cold fires across the white landscape. The sky was the particular pale blue that follows a norther, clear and bright and carrying nothing, all its ammunition spent. Eleanor opened the door. The cold was still profound. She estimated 15 or 16 below zero, perhaps though the mercury had retreated slightly from its midnight extreme. Her breath turned to ice crystals, instantly the moisture of her lungs becoming visible in the air before her face. Her eyes watered and the tears froze on her cheeks before she could raise her hand to wipe them. She looked at the woodpile. After 48 hours of the worst cold in the living memory of Gillespie County, she had burned 1/3 of a cord. She stood in the doorway and looked at the remaining wood and did the arithmetic one final time, and the arithmetic came out the way she had gambled it would come out 4 months ago in a barn with cattle hair in her hands and a memory surfacing from 40 years back. She went inside. June Eliza was awake, sitting up on her pallet, asking in the hoarse voice of a child still carrying a cough for something to eat. Eleanor made cornmeal mush and added the last of the honey and sat on the floor beside her granddaughter and fed her by the spoonful, while Samuel and Lucy woke and the fire burned, and the sealed cabin held its warmth against the brilliant, merciless cold outside. She did not say anything about what the night had been. The children knew what the night had been. Some things do not require narration. 3 miles to the northwest, George Wicker was found 3 days later. He had been returning from a wood-gathering trip on the afternoon of January 14th when the norther struck. He had been perhaps half a mile from his cabin, close enough to see it, close enough to identify the smoke from his own chimney rising against the blue-black sky to the south. He had walked toward it. He had walked with purpose and with everything that remained available to him in the gathering cold. The cold had walked faster. They found him standing upright, or nearly so, the position his body had held when the cold took the last of what he had. He was half buried in drifted snow, facing south, facing his cabin. The smoke had still been rising from his chimney when they found him. His fire had burned through the night without him. Eleanor heard the news from Dorothy, who came across the creek 3 days after the storm to check on the Hartwell cabin and bring dried apple slices she had been saving. Dorothy delivered the news about George Wicker in the careful, matter-of-fact way of a woman who has learned that the frontier's losses are best absorbed directly without softening that delays what must eventually be faced. Eleanor sat with it for a moment. She thought about George Wicker's cabin, which she had seen once years ago. She thought about the gap between his cabin door and the frame, which had been visible from 10 feet away. She thought about the cold that had been inside his cabin that night, not different from the cold outside, not separated from it by 40 degrees or 50 or 60, because the walls between them had been thin and cracked and leaking since they were built. She thought about how it did not matter in the end that George Wicker had reached his door. The door was not the boundary between survival and death. The walls were. She had understood this in August. George Wicker had not had the same opportunity to understand it. That was not his failure. It was simply how information travels unevenly, arriving too late for some, arriving in time for others. No logic to the distribution except the accident of who thought to ask which question when. She would make sure the information traveled further. Harold Vance came on January 18th. He came alone without announcement riding up from the north track in the mid-morning light. Eleanor saw him from the window and watched him dismount and tie his horse to the fence post and stand for a moment looking at the exterior of her cabin, at the white plastered walls and the tight-fitted door, and the woodpile that was still visibly more than half intact after the worst norther in decades. She opened the door before he knocked. He came inside and removed his hat. He stood in the center of her cabin and was still for a long time. He ran his hand along the north wall, pressed his palm flat against the white plaster, held it there feeling for what was not there. He moved to the east wall and did the same. He crouched with the difficulty of a man of 71 crouching in cold weather and examined the floor edge where the plaster met the boards. He rose and crossed to the door frame and ran his fingers along the sealed edge where the draft had always come in every cabin he had ever entered as naturally as water finding low ground. No draft. He looked at the thermometer by the door. He looked at the wood pile through the open door. He turned to face Eleanor. His face was not comfortable. It was the face of a man doing something that does not come easily, not because he lacks the will to do it, but because the thing required is not the direction his 60 years of certainty had been moving. I burned nearly 3 cords in 2 days, he said. My family slept in their clothes. My grandchildren's lips turned blue. He paused. The pause was not dramatic. It was the pause of a man choosing words that cost something. How much did you burn? A third of a cord, Eleanor said. The silence that followed had weight and texture. It was not an empty silence. It was full of the specific content of a man reconsidering, in the space of a few seconds, a significant portion of what he had believed to be true. Vance looked at her hands, at the scars on her palms, the permanent grayness worked into the skin's creases by 43 days of lime, the knuckles that were still slightly swollen in the cold. He looked at the faces of the 3 children who were watching him from the vicinity of the fire, with the calm attention of children who have learned that adults talking seriously should be observed but not interrupted. I told you those grandchildren would freeze in their beds, he said. I told you to sell the kettle and move to town. You did. I was wrong. He said it without qualification or decoration. 3 words pulled up from somewhere below. Pride below certainty, below the 60 years of survived winters that had made him the authority he was in Gillespie County. He said them because they were true, and Harold Vance, whatever his errors, had always ultimately deferred to what was true. Show me how you mix the plaster, Eleanor showed him. She took him through the ratio 1 part lime putty to 3 parts creek sand water to consistency, hair added by handfuls, and worked through the mixture until the fibers were evenly distributed through the whole. She showed him the way to judge the consistency by feel, by the way the plaster clung to a vertical surface when you pressed a sample against the wall. She showed him the scarring on her hands and told him what it meant, what the lime did to skin, and how to protect against it, and why sometimes in the critical moments of application, you could not protect against it and worked anyway. She told him about the loft insulation where heat concentrated at the ceiling. She told him about the floor edges and the door frame, the places where cold found entry that were not the obvious gaps between the logs. She told him about the exterior coat applied second from outside, sealing what the interior coat could not fully reach. Vance listened without interrupting. He had a stillness in him in those moments of genuine learning that was very different from the stillness of his certainty. Certainty was closed. This was open. When she finished, he nodded once. I will tell the others, he said. They should know this. He put his hat back on and walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the latch. The question he was not asking hung in the air between them, how a 63-year-old woman with burned hands and a sick grandchild and $14 and no help had done something that none of the experienced men in Gillespie County had thought to do. He did not ask it because the answer was already visible in the walls around him, in the thermometer by the door and the woodpile that was still standing. He rode away. Eleanor watched him go from the doorway. The cold hit her face and she let it standing in the open door for a moment longer than was comfortable, feeling the sharp, honest air of a Texas January that could not reach the warmth behind her. Then she closed the door. The latch caught solidly in the frame she had reset in October. The word traveled through Gillespie County the way important things traveled in small, isolated communities, not through formal announcement but through the movement of people between properties, through conversations at the settlement store, through the sentences that began. I heard and ended with a question. By the end of January, a dozen families had sent someone to Eleanor's property to look at the plastered walls and ask about the technique. By the middle of February, she had explained the mixing ratio and the application method and the importance of the hair to 15 different people in 15 different conversations. She refused payment for the knowledge. Every time it was offered, she gave the same answer in different words, but with the same meaning. If your family is warm next January because of something I showed you, then I have received what I am owed. The women came first. The same women who had whispered at the settlement store in September, who had exchanged significant looks over the phrase cow hair on the walls, who had watched Eleanor's gamble with the particular complex emotion of people who are hoping someone will succeed while simultaneously preparing for the confirmation that they won't. They came in February with their questions, and Eleanor answered them with the straightforward thoroughness of someone who has no interest in making useful knowledge more difficult to access than it needs to be. She showed them the mixing trough. She demonstrated the consistency test. She explained which limestone burned well and which did not, and why creek sand worked better than hillside clay, and what the hair did structurally to prevent the plaster from cracking through a freeze-thaw cycle. She told them how long to let the quicklime slake and how long to let the putty mature and what signs indicated that the cure had been insufficient. Dorothy Kessler arrived in February with a proposition. She sat across from Eleanor at the limestone table, her weathered hands wrapped around a mug of the chicory coffee that was all the frontier could produce in wartime, and she spoke with the directness that was her nature. "I doubted you," she said. "Not all the way, but enough that I asked the wrong question. I asked whether you could afford the gamble. I should have asked whether you could afford not to make it." She paused. "I was wrong to doubt. Not wrong to say what I said I believed it, but wrong in what I believed." "You came anyway," Eleanor said. "That matters more than what you believed." Dorothy announced she would replaster her own cabin before the following winter. She asked Eleanor to help her burn a fresh batch of lime when the weather permitted. Labor for labor, the frontier's honest currency. Eleanor agreed. It seemed to her the most natural thing in the world that knowledge once acquired at great cost should be passed freely to the person beside you, because the alternative was that the cost was paid for nothing, and she had not paid that cost for nothing. Fletcher Dane never came to Eleanor's cabin that winter. He sent no message. He made no offer on the cattle which had survived the norther without loss because Eleanor had brought them down to the lower pasture before the storm arrived, where the cedar stand offered some shelter and the creek bank cut the wind. He simply stopped the pattern that had defined his relationship to Eleanor's property since Robert's death: the regular visits the patient offers, the waiting that cost a man of means nothing at all. In the spring, she heard that Dane had begun constructing a lime kiln on his north property. She heard it from Dorothy, who had heard it from someone else. No explanation was offered, and none was sought. Eleanor understood what the lime kiln meant, and she filed it under the category of outcomes that did not require her to say anything. By the fall of 1864, 23 cabins in Gillespie County had been sealed with cattle hair plaster. Eleanor helped burn lime for 4 of them, giving her time and knowledge without condition. The technique spread beyond the county through the networks that frontier communities relied on: family letters that moved between settlements, traveling preachers who carried news along with scripture, the casual conversations of people passing on the road. It reached Mason County and Kerr County, and points further by word of mouth carried by people who said simply, "There is a woman in Gillespie County who figured out how to have your firewood needs, and here is what she does." Eleanor's name was sometimes attached to this information and sometimes not. She had no particular feeling about which way it traveled. The technique was not hers. It was older than Texas, older than the Republic part of the long accumulation of practical human knowledge about how to make shelter work in cold climates. Her contribution was not invention. It was application, the willingness to ask a different question at the moment when the standard answer had failed, and to stake everything on the answer that came back. She stayed on the 40 acres when suitors came, and they came widowers and younger men who had heard her story and thought they understood what it meant. She met them with courtesy and declined them with finality. She had proven she could manage the land and the children and the winners. She did not need to prove it again, and she did not need a partner to validate the proof. The land was hers in the way that things become yours when you have paid for them at the full price and received no discount. Samuel took over the farm in the late 1870s, when Eleanor's knees had finally declined to the point where the lower pasture was a journey that required planning. He had his grandfather Robert's practical intelligence and his father's serious eyes in something that was purely his own, a quality of patient, methodical improvement that expressed itself in slowly expanding fences and carefully maintained equipment and the kind of incremental progress that does not announce itself but accumulates into something substantial over years. He named his first son Robert after the grandfather he remembered as the shape of a man in the doorway and the smell of cedar smoke and the sound of an axe in the upper pasture on fall mornings. Lucy married young and moved to Mason County and had children who had children and taught all of them at one point or another in one form or another about the arithmetic of warmth. She had been 7 years old when she watched her grandmother press lime plaster into gaps in a cabin wall with burned hands handing up fresh batches from below, and she had never forgotten the geometry of it, the way the white compound filled the dark space, the way the cold had no answer for a wall that gave it no way in. June Eliza Hartwell grew up to become a midwife. She learned the work from a woman in Fredericksburg who had learned it from someone before her, and she learned it with the particular intensity of someone who understands viscerally what is at stake when a body is struggling, and the person responsible for it is doing everything available to them and waiting to see if it is enough. She rode through blue northers and February ice and summer lightning storms across 3 counties for 4 decades, arriving at farmhouses and remote claims at hours that had no name, carrying what she knew into the dark on behalf of people who needed what she could provide. She delivered more than 200 children. She lost very few. Eleanor Hartwell died in her sleep on a Tuesday morning in early March 1897. She was 77 years old. The winter had been mild, the mildest in several years, and she had spent the early weeks of it doing what she had done every winter since 1863, which was to tend her fire carefully and read the thermometer by the door each morning and note with quiet satisfaction the distance between inside and outside on cold nights. She was buried in the Lutheran cemetery at Fredericksburg beside Robert under a stone that Samuel had ordered from the quarry in Yarno. The stone said Eleanor Hartwell, beloved grandmother. The dates of her birth and death, which spanned 77 years of an America that had changed almost beyond recognition during that span, leaving the hill country, mostly as it had been cedar and limestone and creek water, and the cold that arrived from the north without warning and stayed until it decided to leave. The cabin stood. It stood because she had sealed it with lime and sand and cattle hair, and because sealed walls last longer than walls that are open to what the weather brings. It stood because she had done the work correctly slowly under impossible conditions, with burned hands and a cough that rattled and a fever in the smallest child, and 43 days of 4 hours of sleep between her and the completion of the job. On the coldest mornings of the year, the mornings when the mercury read something that made grown men hesitate, before opening their doors, a thin thread of smoke rose from the chimney of Eleanor Hartwell's cabin. No more than any other morning, no different from any ordinary day. Inside, the thermometer by the door read what it had read every January morning since the winter of 1863. The walls held. They had always held. She had built them too.